In the Western world, we usually look at scarcity as a bad thing, and we look at abundance as a good thing. And I would argue that both have to be managed. There is a value in each one of them. So in your life, you want to manage what you have through constraints. When I grew up in Soviet Russia, it was a command-controlled economy. It was not a free market. Therefore, how much goods get produced was decided by some bureaucrats in some great buildings in Moscow. So we constantly had shortages of goods. I remember my mom was freaking out how she's going to feed us because there were times when the stores did not have any food at all or have very little food. So I experienced a lot of scarcity. We experienced a lot of scarcity in Russia. And then we moved to the United States. I remember going to the grocery store and my eyes almost popping out because instead of one type of butter, there was 50. And I remember we discovered that you can actually buy ice cream in gallons. And when we bought this, this gallon of ice cream, like this huge tub of ice cream home, the first day we had ice cream after dinner. It was incredible. This is a great taste. The second day it was also incredible. 3 months later, we were eating this ice cream, and it almost tasted like we were just eating, basically just eating colored ice. This is when I realized that abundance, which is something that, when I grew up in Russia, we always looked as a great thing, also has its limitations. In the Western world, we usually look at scarcity as a bad thing, and we look at abundance as a good thing. And I would argue that both have to be managed. There is a value in each one of them. Because what happens when you have abundance of something other than parental love or something, or you stop valuing what you have, and the enjoyment you receive from what you have actually declines, which is the paradox of abundance. From an economic perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? So in your life, you want to manage what you have through constraints. Let's talk about the difference between scarcity and constraints. I use these terms interchangeably, but scarcity is something imposed externally on us, and constraints is something we impose on our own by choice. I would argue there is a lot of value in constraints. One of my favorite stores is Costco. Costco only carries 4,000 items, where a regular store like a grocery store, Walmart, carries about 60 to 150,000 items, okay? So because Costco carries only 4,000 items, they're only gonna have not 150 cereals that Walmart will have, but only 4 or 5. For this reason, there's a lot of advantages with that. So number one, the cereals can be, in Costco are loaded on the pallet and then put on the shopping floor by forklift. So therefore, you're gonna have much higher employee productivity. That's number one. Therefore, you have higher revenue per employee, much higher profitability per employee, and therefore you can pay your employees more, they're happier, they stay with you longer, provide better customer service, so everybody wins. But also, there's something else. Because you only sell 4 or 5 cereals, now you have to choose the best cereals to sell. This is where it gets very interesting. So the merchant at Costco, the ones who chooses cereals, now they have to be very careful at curating, because they have to pick the right cereals that people are going to buy. And therefore, what happens as a shopper, when I go to Costco, my anxiety is much less, because when my wife sends me to a grocery store and tells me to buy cereal, there's 150 cereals to choose from. And I'm speaking on behalf of all males. We don't like choice. Okay, we want 4 cereals and nothing more. So therefore, when I go to Costco, I know that if I'm buying cereals, I'm choosing the best cereals out there. When I'm buying couches, the same thing. When I'm buying blueberries, the same thing. And so that actually, what Costco just did, by imposing constraints on themselves, they actually improved shopping experience. And this is why males like me actually love going to Costco, shopping to Costco, and I hate going shopping to a regular grocery. So you can see there is a value in constraints. So by imposing constraints in your life, you can actually improve the quality of your life, because now it mindfully forces you to make decisions. And you may find a different solutions that you wouldn't have seen otherwise once you impose constraints. So let me give you one actually very personal example from parenting and constraints. My son Jonah, who today is 22 years old, after high school for his gap year, he moved to Israel for about a year. He lived, it was a gap year program. He lived in a dormitory. All his expenses were paid except food. I gave Jonah just enough money that he had to be very careful how much he pays for food. I think he had to live in Israel for $100 a week, which if you think about it, that's not a lot of money in Israel, which is kind of an expensive country. Jonah told me that this was incredibly educational for him because there were times he never starved, but at times he had to, live a day or two on the black beans. He had to go at times to restaurants with his friends where they ordered food, and he drank water. And he said, even though at times it was kind of uncomfortable, he looks at that experience as a very positive experience because it was incredibly educational. And in fact, he would argue that it made him appreciate what he has a lot more. Now, as a parent, it's kind of tricky because I moved from Russia. My parents brought me here because they wanted me to have a better life. And as a parent, I want my kids to have a better life. But at the same time, I actually want them to appreciate what they have. So imposing these constraints on Jonah, on his budget, I would argue made Jonah appreciate a lot more what he has. Now, then I made a mistake. So then Jonah moves to Denver, COVID strikes, and Jonah starts basically goes to college, and he door dashes. And actually for this 6 or 8 months, actually that's not the mistake part. For 6 or 8 months, he basically does not ask me for money. He pays for his own food and everything. And Jonah told me later that he loved it. He loved that he was self-sufficient. He did not ask me for money. Okay, and then this is when mistake comes. Then schools open up, the COVID is over, Jonah goes to school. And at that point, I just gave Jonah my credit card and said, spend responsibly. I could see every transaction he would make, and every transaction was a responsible transaction, semi-responsible transaction. At that point in time, I just wanted Jonah to focus on his school and nothing else. And he was getting perfect grades, so I didn't really stress that much about how much money he was spending because he was responsible, with his money. Maybe 2 years later, a year and a half later, Jonah comes to me and says, Dad, next year I'm going to move in with my girlfriend. I would like to have a budget. I would like you to give me a fixed amount of money. If I spend more, it's my problem. If I spend less, I would keep what I don't spend. He said, because every time I make a decision, it actually gives me anxiety because I'm thinking, am I spending responsibly or not? And also he says, the problem is the incentives for me that are not poorly aligned because I have absolutely no reason to spend responsibly. And I second guess every time I spend money. So Jonah and I went through a negotiating process. I gave him 30% less than what he asked for. He has a fixed budget. He gets a certain amount of money a month. He's so happy. He's spending probably half the money that he spent when he had my credit card. But now he is meal prepping every Sunday. He's literally preparing his meals for the whole week so he doesn't have to go to Chipotle for lunch. Him and his girlfriend make a menu. He thinks he can actually save money so he can travel. In this case, you can see where constraints were actually led to much better aligned incentives and to personal responsibility. And the reason I think it's important because when Jonah graduates, he's going to face a real life where even if he makes a decent amount of money, he can always spend more. Okay? And by putting constraints on himself, putting the budget basically, now, preparing him for the future when he becomes an adult and he has to manage his budget. So I think there's this is one of many examples about constraints. I can keep going for another 30 minutes. Abundance is great, but there's a downside to it as well. And so constraints, the way my parents faced it in Russia, you can argue it made me appreciate what I have today as well. So it's kind of a form of negative visualization that was imposed upon me by Soviet bureaucrats. But anyway, that's my story about constraints.